Deputy Catherine Murphy to move the motion.
Thank you.
Deputy to move.
I move the motion. And while Minister, I know that you're not long in this particular role, but I know you appreciate that the National Broadband process has been, in one form or another, has been something that's been ongoing for a number of years. Yet still, people find themselves in modern Ireland, but no or limited access to the tools required to participate in a modern society and a modern economy. And that's why it's crucial that we get broadband to people. But I can't emphasise enough, we must do so in a way that ensures that it's not just an unimpeachable process that has satisfied itself to the veracity of the winning bidder and its ability to deliver long term, but in a way that also focuses on the net result for consumers, particularly in the area of affordability and indeed the speeds of broadband itself. There's no point in going ahead with the process when the infrastructure is finally in place and an average household cannot afford to connect to the network, or the network is inadequate ultimately. This must be about empowering our citizens to connect with a globalised world, both in their business and personal endeavours. And this process must also be able to guarantee the ability of the winning bidder to actually deliver the project, or else we'll end up paying either in real terms by way of state subsidy and or by citizens paying the price of not being able to connect to broadband. And I think we've got to remember that this is a contract that will be, if it's awarded, it will be awarded for a very large length of time, and if it's not got right, then reversing it becomes, for example, compensatable and could be very problematic. It's a fairly old adage to say that we must learn from past mistakes, yet nothing in the broadband process to date gives me confidence that we will not repeat the mistakes of the past, and indeed current mistakes, when it comes to the tendering process and the eventual awarding of this contract. Right now we're watching as a result of what was clearly a flawed process which surrounded the National Children's Hospital come home to roost. Colossal costs, overruns, a timescale that has missed every deadline, more times than I can remember to count, and huge frustrations on all sides of the project. Minister, we're being asked on this side of the House to trust the people who have been responsible for the like of the National Children's Plan in making the final decision, and we're being asked to do that blind. We watched too as Metro North had a similar incoherent and rocky process with numerous incarnations and setbacks. The same can be said of Lewis and the eventual need for Cross-City Lewis, which I think was in there to begin with. In fact, there are a myriad of projects anyone could point to as an example of our continued inability in this country to get major projects right first time out. Now, Minister, this is not all on your watch, and I completely acknowledge that. We have a failure kind of on an ongoing basis, and the penny has to drop that we have to look at what we've been doing wrong in relation to those failures, and not just blame it on a system failure. If there's a system failure, you've got to fix the system. The problems that we are now witnessing with the National Children's Hospital, for example, are not as a result of something that happens after the project begins. Yes, there's some element of that, but they're mainly as a result of a laissez-faire approach to the tendering contract process before the project even commences. And if you don't ensure that the design plan, the building blocks and indeed the builders are the correct choice, then you can bet that you're going to end up with a less than satisfactory outcome. That's why this period in the life cycle of the National Broadband Plan is so important. If we don't get things right now, we absolutely will pay the price later on. We've a one-off chance now before any contracts are awarded to ask ourselves truthfully if we can stand over the process to date and that we genuinely believe that the process, as it stands, is going to deliver the best possible outcome for both the users and the Exchequer. We all know that significant and serious questions arose during 2017 regarding the behaviour of the Minister in his handling of the National Broadband Plan, and the crescendo of that controversy. Myself, Fianna Fáil and others in this House said that the National Broadband Plan was fatally flawed. To try and prove otherwise, the Government commissioned the Peter Smith report in a bid to reassure people that the Minister attending various dinner parties and exchanging regular private calls and texts with the owner of the sole remaining bidder wasn't a problem. At the time, I raised concerns about the ability of Peter Smith to be entirely impartial on this, given that he had been the process auditor throughout the process which had caused the controversy. This was a process failure, and he was auditing that process. When the Smith report was furnished to this House, it's no exaggeration to say that most people were underwhelmed with its watery findings, which claimed that in the absence of the minutes or of a written record of many of the interactions between the Minister, the Junior Minister and David McCourt, he had taken the key players at their word that nothing appropriate had unfolded. When Mr Smith, at a follow-up press conference, made comments to the effect that he didn't interrogate the Minister or Mr David McCourt because he didn't think it was appropriate, I think it's fair to say he significantly undermined the veracity of the report and left serious question marks hanging over an all too familiar vista of major communications contracts, a minister and a billionaire businessman. Again, we must consider our learnings, or lack of learnings, from past mistakes. In the same way, we must look to the forerunner of the National Broadband Plan and ensure the lessons from its rollout and its operation informs the Broadband Plan. The forerunner is known as the MANS project, or the Municipal Area Networks, first established in 2004. And contract extensions were awarded to ENET back in 2016, which will run to 2030. Question marks and indeed court proceedings remain in relation to the detail behind those contracts and their extension, yet despite an order from both the Information Appeals Commissioner and the High Court to release the details in the public interest, the Department has continually refused to do so and has in fact taken an appeal to the Court of Appeal, which obviously will be a costly exercise, to keep the information which is in the public interest out of the public eye. Such secrecy raises serious warning bells for me, and indeed it flies in the face of the stated ambition of an open government or governance approach. But even leaving aside the significant questions hanging over the contract process for ENET and the MANS, a whole set of questions hangs over the operation, efficiency and indeed usefulness in terms of the end-user take-up of the networks. Back in 2014, BT Ireland wrote to the Department expressing serious concerns regarding how ENET were operating the municipal area networks. A number of people and businesses report not being able to connect as the costs are prohibitive, and it's not even in actual fact, in some cases it's public bodies. And many industry experts question the scale, coverage and take-up of the MANS network across the country. Those living in the intervention area should pay serious attention to this, because if this is not got right and if we don't have learnings from this, exactly the same thing can be expected to happen or could happen in relation to the National Broadband Plan. A recent Freedom of Information dump from the Department to journalist Jack Horgan-Jones of the Irish Times includes a briefing note prepared for the Minister in 2016 ahead of a meeting he was due to have with David McCourt, who at the time was heading the consortium which had acquired ENET, who were operating the MANS. That briefing note is 2 years after BT Ireland, a major telecoms player with significant expertise, has made its submission to the Department outlining serious concerns with ENET operation of the MANs. The briefing note in 2016 makes absolutely no reference to those concerns and states that the MANs programme has proven effective. Now, it hasn't proven effective if there are concerns being raised by business, by individuals, and where there's a proven difficulty with take-up and cost. It is surely hard to argue that a briefing which fails to acknowledge the serious concerns of a major industry expert like BT is a comprehensive briefing. You can't just ignore that. So far, we've had only part of one of the two departmental commissioned reports into the MANs put in the public domain, namely the Norcondale report. We only saw part of that report, not the full report. And we're still awaiting the publication of the analysis Mason report into the operation of the MANs. Minister, this is ridiculous that we don't have, we don't have that information, that we can adequately consider this issue, look at, what has gone wrong, what has gone right, so as that we consider this contract. Very often you're an expert after you have completed a process, where really you need to be an expert in advance of that process. And the experience of the previous, or the forerunner to the National Broadband Plan, should be seriously one of the most important pieces of documentation that both you have available to you, but we as the opposition have available to us as well. That such secrecy and obfuscation surrounds this process should be a concern in and of itself. That the Minister and the Department has pushed through to the Court's appeals, it may well have been prior to your tenure, Minister, rather than accepting the High Court judgment and a ruling of the Information Commissioner to release details of the MANs contracts with ENET, should raise eyebrows. That the Peter Smith report, by the author's own admission, is lacking in veracity should raise concerns again in its own right. That the process has found itself with only one sole remaining bidder should raise eyebrows. Surely a contract of this magnitude should have had competitors beating down the doors to win it. Yet we know that that major telecoms players such as Eir and Ciro pulled out of the process. They cited governance and regulatory concerns. Do we really know what those concerns are? Have they been properly interrogated? Have we satisfied ourselves as to what governance and regulatory concerns both Eir and Ciro were referring to? And I really don't believe we have, Minister. I do know that Eir have, at my request, agreed to come to the Public Accounts Committee next month, while Ciro have not accepted that invitation, and ENET have agreed with some significant caveats as to what they will and won't discuss. Minister, both your predecessor and yourself have been saying for some time now that a decision on the awarding of the National Broadband Plan contract is imminent. This motion is asking you to assure this House and indeed the Irish public that such an important decision is not just being taken on the basis that we're too far along a flawed process to turn back and get it right. If getting it right means that there's a delay in the process, well, that is far preferable than ploughing ahead only to find ourselves a year or two down the road, hand-wringing, as we are currently doing in relation to the National Children's Hospital, and wondering where it all went so badly wrong in terms of the costs. There is a very high risk in terms of the makeup of this particular consortium in relation to the ability to deliver on this broadband plan. And we have got to be concerned about the costs in terms of the end user and indeed the exchequer, who could end up picking up very large subsidies. And As I understand it, there is no comprehensive map within the department or with the regulator as to what networks might already exist, or indeed the penetration within those networks in terms of the take-up of broadband. Surely it makes sense to have an audit of current capacity before ploughing ahead with anything new, so that we can reduce duplication and possibly cost. For example, we know the ESB rolled out a significant fibre optic domestic network using European Union funds. People with more technical knowledge than myself tell me it wouldn't be a major job to use those networks to tack on the necessary hardware for broadband capabilities. Can the Minister comment on this? Similar, we know that Bord Gáis have rolled out the Aurora network. We also know that ESET laid lines across parts of the country between Ballina and Tubbercurry, for example, again with EU funding. At the moment, Air are in the process of providing fibre optic cabling across, to areas which they deem economically viable for their own bottom line. What consideration, if any, has been given to the possibility of using any or all of these networks for even a partial rollout of broadband? As I understand it, the ESB domestic fibre optic network was established at a cost of €59 million. To date, has any discussion taken place between the ESB and the Department about the potential use of those networks? We know that the Man's dispute despite being operated by ENET, are actually a state-owned asset. Surely we must ensure that any current or future use of the infrastructure must oblige the user benefiting from the public finances to provide the service to all, regardless of the cost to the provider. Having said that, I'm acutely aware of the warning that was given by one of the consortia that dropped out at a conference following that, who said that there was a real discussion needed to take place in the context of the last 15% of the country in terms of the rollout of the broadband plan in terms of economic viability, and said that we needed to have an honest discussion about that. I'd like us to hear what are the impediments or the possible impediments in relation to that. Because I'm sure that would have been articulated in terms of problems with rollout. People in rural Ireland, and indeed, Minister, not so rural Ireland, indeed, there's pockets of my constituency that is really seen as the commuter belt area. It's not exactly the most rural part of the country, but indeed there's pockets of it that have very unreliable broadband. So it's not an exclusively rural issue. And indeed, I think even in this city, you can find spots where it's not particularly good. But for reliable and sustainable, but it will be only guaranteed. We can only be guaranteed such a service if we get this process right while we have a chance. Otherwise, they might find that the consortium of self-interested business people are given a free rein to choose when and where it suits them to prioritise, and how affordable it decides to make the end product. And there are people are not taking up demands. I can't emphasise this enough, because of affordability. I particularly ask you, Minister, to address that when you're talking about the National Broadband Plan and what guarantees there might be in that. It's in nobody's interest, Minister, and this motion here tonight is attempting to ensure that we don't make the same mistake yet again. And I've got to say that it's very obvious that we have a really serious problem with an institutional deficiency in terms of oversight of capital projects. There's some areas that we do reasonably well in because there's a lot of expertise, such as roads. But I've got to say, in some of the other projects, it's like as if we're spending monopoly money, not the people's real money, and we've got to be prudent about the process. Otherwise, it's going to be costly, and there's the potential of not delivering on what's been promised. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Murphy. Now, Minister Richardson.